This story dates back to the late 90s. I'm a male, and I was around 15 at the time, and I was living in Bournemouth in the UK with my family. My parents purchased a Victorian hotel with 9 guest bedrooms, and we moved into the hotel owner's accommodation. My parents had their room on the ground floor, and my brother and I had a room each in the basement. The hotel was a nice place. It had a happy feel to it, except in certain areas. There was one room, number 7 on the top floor, that had a strange vibe when inside it. Whilst cleaning this room, there was a closeness, as if the air around was closing in on you, and a ringing in your ears that only really became apparent when you left the room itself. I always kept the door open when I had to work on this room, and was happy when I got to leave. We'll come back to this room later. Within the first few months living in the hotel, it was apparent to the whole family that things were happening that could not be explained by everyday logic. The large old doors around the hotel were heavy and had been fitted with auto closers for fire safety reasons. This made it generally difficult to open them at times, particularly when carrying trays or hotel supplies. However, often we would be walking through parts of the hotel and a door would swing open. We would expect someone to walk out of the connecting room, but there would be no one there. Another occurrence experienced by my entire family at some point or another was the feeling of being hit by a sudden gust of wind, even when in a room with all doors and windows closed. We're not talking about a little breeze. This was like someone held a large rotary fan up to our face and put it on maximum power. Then, after the wind stopped, there would be a strong smell of gingery aftershave. The first major incident we had involved room 7. A couple and their 10-year-old daughter were staying in the room. After dinner, the parents went to the bar for some drinks, but the daughter was bored, so wanted to go watch TV in their room, so she did. All was fine until another guest entered the bar area and asked if anyone was staying in room 7, as they could hear someone screaming in that room. My parents and the girl's parents ran upstairs and went into the room and found the daughter sitting up in bed in floods of tears. When asked what was wrong, she said she had fallen asleep and then woken up to see a man standing in the room. My parents asked what the man looked like, thinking it was one of the other guests in the hotel, but the description she gave was of a tall man wearing a top hat and that he had hair down the sides of his face, but not a beard. She effectively described a Victorian man with sideburns. Her parents asked where he went, but she didn't know. When she woke up, he told her to stay in bed and go back to sleep. That's when she said she started screaming, and when she looked back up, he was gone. They searched the hotel, but no one was found, and none of the guests came close to matching the description. They put it down to a bad dream, but my family was sure there was more to it than that. Not that we ever talked to the guests about the supernatural occurrences. We figured it would cause more issues if people actively knew. It was a few months before the next sighting. The ground floor layout of the hotel was quite basic. There was a main lobby area, and off from that were the different rooms, lounge, dining room, kitchen, etc. The bar was part of an old extension, only accessible through the dining room. This meant that if you were sat in a certain position in the bar, you could see directly through the dining room and into the main lobby and stair area. A guest was sat having a drink in that exact spot when she turned to my mum, standing behind the bar, and excitedly said, "Oh, you have a wedding party in." Mum was quite confused and asked what the guest was referring to. The guest said that a man wearing a full top hat and tails had just walked down the stairs. My mum moved round beside the bar and looked out the window towards the entrance of the hotel, at which point the guest said, "He didn't go that way, he went down to the right side of the stairs. What the guest didn't know was that the right of the stairs led to our private quarters. Mum and Dad went to check, but there was no one there, and although there were ways out of the building, they were locked and bolted from the inside, so no one could have exited through them without it showing. Another common occurrence in the hotel would be the sound of running. When on the ground floor, you would hear running upstairs. This was not surprising when the hotel had guests. In an old Victorian hotel, every sound was heard and magnified. But over the Christmas break, we would shut the upper floors of the hotel and just have family time. But the running around would still continue. It was so loud at one point that we were sure someone had broken in. My brother, Dad, and even I went upstairs clutching kitchen knives for safety, but after unlocking and checking the rooms, no one was up there. A guest started staying long-term in the hotel. I don't recall what his job was, but he had business some of the year in Bournemouth, and certain other days he had to travel into London. On London days, he would need to be out of the hotel by 5 a.m. Mum would leave him out a continental breakfast. He would help himself to it and be gone before we woke up, returning later in the evening. One day, when returning from London, he was chatting to my parents, and he said something strange had happened when he left the hotel that morning. He had come out of his room as usual, and was surprised to see a boy stood on the half landing leading up to the top floor of the hotel. The man was not used to seeing anyone else up at 4:30, but being polite, he said good morning to the boy. He said the boy did not say anything. Instead, he just turned and slowly walked up to the top floor. The man thought it was strange, but carried on with his normal morning routine. My parents were puzzled by this and asked him what the boy had looked like. He said he was around 8 or 9 years old, but could not recall what the boy was wearing. The reason my parents were confused was because at the time we had no children staying in the hotel. Many months later, whilst serving breakfast, a guest came into the dining room and quite loudly asked my mum, "Is this hotel haunted?" All the other guests stopped eating, intrigued by the question, and even more so by what the answer would be. My mum played it cool, simply saying, "Why do you ask?" The lady replied that she had woken up in the night and there was a boy stood in her room. She said hello to the boy and he vanished. Mum acted surprised and said it was the first she had heard of anything like that, again playing it down in front of all the listening ears. The final incident involved me. I had been saving my money up to buy a watch, a storm watch to be precise. I had finally managed to get enough money together and had made my way to town to pick up the watch. It was my first ever expensive purchase, if I recall, around £90 at the time. When it was time to go to bed, I took the watch off and went to put it on the bedside table. However, in each room, there were internal phones next to the bed. This was in case my parents needed our help or guests were checking in, so we could be called to assist. The bedside table in my room was so small, the phone took up all the space. For that reason, I decided to lay the watch over the receiver of the phone and hope no one called me in the night. My bed was one of those large metal bunk beds. It had a single bed at the top and a sofa bed that folded out into a small double. I slept on the bottom, partly because it was a double, but realistically because the ceiling was so low, you could not physically sleep up top anyway. I remember being woken in the night to the loudest clanging metal sound as my whole bed shook. It felt and sounded as though someone had taken a run and jump and landed on the metal ladder of the bed. I was facing the wall at the time and remember the utter fear I felt. I would say it's the only time in my life I have been frozen in fear. No part of me would move. I just lay there, too scared to turn over and see what had caused the entire bed to shake. I'm not sure I would have been able to call for my brother, but he was away at PGL summer camp, so could not have helped me anyway. I lay there for hours, just staring at the wall. Finally, the light shone down from the basement window and filled my room. I plucked up the courage to turn and look, and thankfully there was no one there. I sat up in bed, and the first thing I noticed was the watch was gone from the top of the phone. I searched around the floor, thinking maybe it had slid off. Then I thought about the noise my bed had made, as if someone had jumped on it. Slowly peering up to the top bed, there, in the middle of the mattress, was my watch. I guess the little boy wanted to play with it too. My mum went on to research the local history of the hotel. She was able to find out a doctor had lived there when it was first built as a house, and during the time there, a young boy had died from an illness, but I can't remember the exact details of how. We owned the hotel for many years before selling it. It later was converted into flats, and I often wonder if they still have any occurrences. My wife used to work at the Great Wolf Lodge in Mason, Ohio. She worked third shift at the front desk for 5 years, and things would happen there constantly. Many times I would take her to work and hang out in the lobby until she got off, instead of making the long drive back home and then back to get her in the morning. Employees she worked with would share stories with me all the time of things that happened to them or to guests. One room in particular, that seems to be the most haunted, had reports from guests that something in the middle of the night would jump on their beds. One day, the bathtub overflowed and the water leaked down into the basement. When they checked the room, nobody had been in there and the room hadn't been rented. It seemed as if a lot of things that happened there either happened in the lobby or on the first floor. The lobby and main floor are actually the second floor. They don't work alone at night. The place is just too big. They always had at least 2 at the front desk doing night audit, but usually it was 3 of them, and there was almost always at least 1 security guy working on third too, and his office was behind the front desk, so there were always 3 or 4 people working at night. And then when I was hanging out there most nights, I was lucky in that I got to experience as much as I did without having to pay to stay there. Every night they had to print a report and get it from the main office on the first floor. My wife went downstairs, and while she walked, the elevator started following her from the lobby to the first floor. When she got down there, the doors to it opened and nobody was on it, nor was there anybody waiting for it. Another night, she had got the report and was waiting at the doors for the elevator. Behind her, she heard a man say, "You never asked me for my name." She spun around and nobody was there. She walked down the halls and found nobody with her anywhere. One night she got a call from the office, but nobody was supposed to be in there, and it was locked at night. The night shift supervisor went down to check it out with security and found the door to still be locked and nobody in there. That happened quite a bit. One time he came back upstairs from checking, and as soon as he reached the top of the stairs, a phone that sat at the host station at one of the restaurants there rang. So he picked it up. The extension it called was from the office, and he heard nothing but dead air. Pardon the pun. A religious man and skeptic, he just laughed it off as he always did and hung up the phone with a shrug. Another night, she got a call from an extension she didn't recognize, and when she answered it, she heard nothing but dead air, Not even her supervisor knew the extension. After hanging up, she decided to call the extension back, and the phone in front of her supervisor, who sat right next to her at the desk, rang. He picked it up, and they confirmed it was her that called, except it wasn't his extension at all. And upon further investigation, they found that extension did not exist anywhere in the hotel. One night, she heard a scream for help from the gift shop off the lobby. It was locked up, but a girl was in early to get set up. Nobody else, including that girl and my wife's supervisor sitting next to her, heard it. Security went to check, but found nothing. One night I had to use the bathroom, so I walked down the hall off the lobby to the bathroom. As I got to it, I looked up and saw someone walking in ahead of me. All I saw was their leg from about the knee down. It appeared to be a white guy, red shorts, white socks, and red shoes. I was only a few feet away, yet nobody had been in front of me in the hall. And as I went into the bathroom, I didn't see him, so I looked in each stall and found I was alone. There was absolutely nowhere for him to go. Another night, sometime around Halloween, they had the lobby all decorated and there was a DJ booth. Right around 4:45 in the morning, he began playing a song really loud and scared the hell out of all of us. The supervisor went to shut it off, and after he did, he informed us that it had been off when he came in. I mean, it had been off the whole time I was there too. The place is right next to King's Island, which is also supposed to be haunted, and the ghost hunters did a show from there once and found nothing. I'm not sure why they never bothered going to the lodge next door to hunt. They probably turn up all kinds of things, as stuff happens regularly there. Maybe the company doesn't want that kind of publicity. Guess I ruined that. Should you ever happen to do some hunting, things seem to happen mostly between 3 and 5 in the morning. I'm a 23-year-old female, and just wanted to share what I would call my first real encounter. Even as a lifelong skeptic, I can't explain this one. If you're familiar with US ghost hunting spots, you might have heard of the Copper Queen Hotel in Bisbee, Arizona. It's been open since 1902 and has been the subject of multiple paranormal investigations and shows, and there are supposed to be 3 documented ghosts that inhabit it. That of a drowned child, a man in a top hat, and a forlorn lady of the night. My boyfriend and I decided on Saturday morning that we would take a trip to make up for a missed birthday. We had never gone on a real trip together, so we didn't plan it well, or at all really. We realized we were about 1.5 hours from Bisbee and decided to book a hotel once we got there. We chose the Copper Queen because it's the most prominent hotel in the area and is right in the middle of everything. We weren't aware of its reputation as a paranormal hotspot. The room itself was old-looking, as to be expected with a hotel that old. Yellowing wallpaper, splintering wood floors, dim lighting. The locks on the door were pretty flimsy, and you had to actively yank it shut or it would fall open again. We joked that it looked like the Tower of Terror. After a day of walking around, we came back to get changed. We heard a creaking noise, and I had my boyfriend check under the bed, only half seriously, but I was still relieved that nobody was there. We grabbed a lighter and went out for a smoke, then came back, showered, watched TV for a little, and then turned out the lights. The moment we shut the lights off, there was a variety of clicks, creaks, and pops in odd patterns. It being an old room, and us being a logical couple, we figured it was the old fan or the wall-mounted AC. I was listening to the noises when I felt my boyfriend freeze up next to me. "Is that you?" I responded no, that it was the AC. "No, that. Seriously, is that you?" I asked what he meant and waited for a minute or so before asking again. And again. Finally, he answered. I was trying to listen. "Babe, I hear someone breathing." We reasoned that it was the room next door and settled back into our pillows. And then I remembered. There wasn't another room on that side. Our room was the first on the landing, and the side we were closest to, the side my boyfriend would have been able to hear, if at all, was the main staircase. Him being a 21-year-old boy is blessed with the ability to fall asleep within seconds. I could hear him snoring, and his legs were over mine, but I was too anxious to sleep. I then felt the lightest tap on the top of the quilt, just next to my feet. I froze, but tried to reason to myself that my boyfriend had twitched in his sleep, although his legs were still on top of mine. A few moments passed, and I thought I had imagined it, and then I felt a pinch and a tugging motion at the same area of the quilt. I woke my boyfriend and demanded he check under the bed. I was still reasoning that there was a non-supernatural explanation for the events, and it occurred to me that although we had checked before leaving for our walk, we hadn't checked after. The flimsy lock and the fact that the door was difficult to close made it seem likely that someone could have snuck in. My boyfriend was too groggy to be useful, so I grabbed my phone, turned the flashlight on, and leapt as far from the bed as I could while crouching to check what was under it. Nothing. We were both a little freaked by this point and agreed to turn the TV back on to drown out any weird noises. We turned on Futurama and settled back into bed for the third time. Again, my boyfriend fell asleep within seconds. I was drifting off when I heard the audio on the TV cut somehow. It suddenly shifted tone to where it sounded like a grainy VHS instead of a streaming adult cartoon. I heard a woman saying something about a phantom, and then a blood-curdling scream from the TV. At this point, I was too scared to open my eyes, so I steadied my breathing and pretended to be asleep. That's the last event I could recall, and upon checking out the next day, the manager asked if we had experienced anything. That's when we Googled the hotel and found out about its history of hauntings. So there it is. Nothing too crazy compared to others, but I have definitely never experienced anything like that before, and don't have any explanation besides the paranormal. This happened to me about 6 months ago when I was visiting Colorado with my family. For context, my boyfriend and I had booked night tour tickets to the Stanley, and I was thrilled. For clarification, I'm something of a hopeful skeptic, and my boyfriend is more on the side of disbelief entirely. I would just go ahead and call him a skeptic, but his conviction goes far beyond the ramifications of the word in this context to my belief. I think he thinks the whole idea of ghosts and the paranormal is fun, but it just doesn't seem realistic to him, and he outright refuses to put any belief in the idea. I was genuinely excited for the whole thing. Me, being the little ghoul I am, had already done research into the whole history of the building, and was mainly just excited to be there and see what the tour had to offer. My boyfriend, the trooper he is, was just along for the ride. The tour guide allegedly warned us before we began that due to the high altitude, we may feel faint or pass out, and if we felt we were going to, it was okay to step out or take a moment, and that the tour would circle back around. Important note, I suffer from heart palpitations, and they have been intense enough in the past that I've had to fight to stay conscious. I have almost passed out before due to them, but the cause wouldn't be something such as altitude, and even if that did happen, I decided to decline the prospect of missing any of the tour at the beginning. In all seriousness, I was going to stay in the tour, even if I had severe palpitations. Let's cut to the chase, and I will say this while leaving out as much as possible, so it's an entirely blank slate experience for any who might wish to attend. It was time to enter Lucy's room. There was no light whatsoever in this room, except for a red light in the hallway, which spilled into the entryway of the room, but did absolutely nothing in the way of revealing the interior. My boyfriend was actually a little jumpy and hot-footed since he was a little wary of entering. I remember pushing him out of the way, not literally, I just got in front of him and saying, "Don't be scared," and entering. Why would I say this, you might ask? I want it to be known, I was genuinely excited to be there. I was genuinely excited at the prospect of seeing something I couldn't explain, and having a reason to believe. There was an ounce of fear in me, of course, but I couldn't imagine any time being wasted due to fear. I was far too elated at the entire situation and the prospects it held. We entered, and I put myself in the corner so I still had a view of the door and the people coming in. From the moment I entered, I began to see little white shapes dance across my vision. No biggie, I had seen similar shapes in dark rooms as a child, nothing new there. Something to do with my eyes adjusting to the light, no doubt. However, just under a minute of me being in this corner, I noticed as I was watching people file into the room, I started seeing their after images follow behind them. Not anything like a little blur that covered the next people coming in to make that effect. I kept seeing the same person enter over and over again like a haze, and it was happening for everyone. For instance, guy number 1 is super buff and short. After he entered the first time, I would see the exact same shape follow close behind. Girl number 2, who was super tall and lanky, would enter for the first time, and I would see her shape follow close behind and enter the room over and over again, and it wouldn't stop. I think there's a term for this experience actually, and in those stories, the visual effects follows the person. These kept going. I started to think my eyes were playing tricks on me due to the light, and I wiped my eyes to get rid of it. Nope, kept happening. I began to feel light, like I was floating and light as a feather. I could no longer feel the floor beneath me, or anything for that matter. And don't imagine it as being lifted. It was suddenly like all sense just disappeared except sight. Nothing around me, like I was there but I wasn't, and even that doesn't describe it. It almost felt like I was being held off the ground, in suspension, but there was no weight pulling me down. I felt like I weighed nothing at all, and I remember envisioning a feather in the center of my chest. I felt what can only be described as my head falling backwards and my eyes closing, but I could see perfectly, and there was no concept of shape. I remember being able to trust that I wasn't actually falling though, due to the fact that I was leaning against the wall behind me before the whole thing occurred, which kept me grounded. I remember having to fight to regain control over my body, and when I looked up, the hazes were still happening. Same guy, number 1, entering the room over and over again. Same girl, number 1, entering the room over and over again. I remember feeling a sense of danger and knowing I needed to leave, so I said, "I need to go," and waited to see if the hazes cleared. They didn't, but the hazes seemed to move out of the way instead. I remembered gunning it for the door and hoping I didn't hit anybody. The hallway was distorted, like looking through a fisheye lens. The walls were tall and round, and the floor was thin and long, and the red light was intense. I ran back to the stairs I initially came down and noticed the carpet was distorted as well. No color changes, but certain areas of the pattern were bulged and round, and other parts were thin and spindly. I ran up the stairs as best I could, and my vision began to blank. When I remembered this part now, I distinctly remember it in frames. Like I remember being by one chair when I came up the stairs, and being much further away and closer to the doors next. Not like a fluid memory that plays normally in your head. And at the moment I got out of the doors, it was normal again. It took a few seconds to clear up, but almost instantly after, I was fine again, completely fine. Now, as I said, I have almost passed out before on multiple occasions, and for me, there's a warning and a sense of dread. There's panic, and I know it's coming ahead of time. And now, due to a more recent event, I've almost passed out due to low blood sugar, so I still haven't experienced anything like this. Also, in the moment I felt like I was falling back, I felt no fear, only confusion and peace. I wondered what was happening, but I wasn't terrified and panicking in the moment like I have been since. I've never experienced anything visual like this either, not since or before. In fact, nothing I experienced in this story I have experienced before or after, which is why this experience excited me. The moment everything cleared away after I got outside, as well as I remember being super angry with myself for not sticking through it and seeing what happened, because I got exactly what I wanted. A super cool experience with no explanation from my end. I heard later on from another person on the tour that she thought I was an actor, which was fun, and the buff guy was a real guy. He told me later on his wife had to stop him from running too. I understand this sounds super made up and crazy, because even though I have fun telling friends and family this story, it definitely comes across as a short fiction on paper. But I promise, for what it's worth, this actually happened. And this is actually one of the best stories I'll ever have, most likely. In the moment after I returned to the group, my boyfriend was super supportive and comforting. When I returned, the little white shapes I mentioned previously came back and stayed until we left the room. When my girlfriend and I first started dating, we decided to take a trip to Florida one August. We quickly realized why flights and hotels in Florida were so cheap in August. We booked a hotel close to the beach and did typical Midwest people Florida things over the long weekend. The second to last night we were there, I woke up in the middle of the night. I'm a very light or bad sleeper. Always have been. I laid in bed for about 20 minutes and eventually rolled over on my side, facing the hallway to the bathroom. I opened my eyes and saw a woman with very fair, almost fluorescent skin, with dark hair, walking towards the bathroom. As this loosely describes my girlfriend, I assumed it was her, and I stretched out my arms, and to my surprise, touched my girlfriend on the other side of the bed. Realizing what happened, I instantly tapped her awake. She asked me what happened, and I just explained that I had a nightmare. She consoled me, and we both went back to sleep. Looking back, I'm surprised I didn't freak out and ask to move rooms, because I'm such a fraidy cat. A real sprint up the stairs right before bed kind of guy. But I never really felt afraid or uneasy, more surprised. But what I saw the last night of our trip, I made sure to get drunk enough that 1, I didn't care what had happened the night before, and 2, that I would sleep throughout the night. I didn't tell my girlfriend until we arrived at the airport, and the first thing she said was, Thank you so much for not telling me until now." While at the airport, I googled the hotel, and the first suggested search was such and such hotel haunted. I guess back in the day, Al Capone and his cronies spent a lot of time there 1 or 2 renovations ago. This is a story about an encounter my mum had, and is 100% true to her recollections. Some background. During this time, I was probably around 16. Me, my mum, and my sister lived in a hotel or B&B or whatever you want to call it. My mum was the owner at the time. The property itself is made up of 2 very old Victorian period houses joined together. The front entrance would lead to the main road, and the back entrance would lead to what was almost an alley between the 2 houses before leading out to the rear car park. We've all had different experiences around the property. You know, the usual stuff, like being in a room and feeling uncomfortable, like someone is there with you. Bangs and creaks on old wooden floorboards, things going missing and then turning back up. You know, the usual stuff. So to the night of the encounter. It was around 10 or 11 at night. I think there would have been a huge event happening in the city where I lived at the time. The hotel was fully booked, and my mum was waiting for the final check-in of the night. My mum was expecting a party of 4, and we just so happened to have a room with 2 double beds, 2 couples basically. Around the time of 10 or 11 p.m, she received a phone call from the party. They had arrived and were in the car park, asking where the entrance was. My mum said she'd come and meet them, as it was dark and guests like people to go that extra mile, even for a bed and breakfast. So my mum gets up from the kitchen at the time, heads through the dining room. To the left, you'd have the front door, and to the right, you'd have the main landing area, stairs, and a little walkway to the back door. As she approaches the back door and heads down the walkway, a small boy in a blue and white stripy hooped t-shirt and shorts, with short blonde hair, runs past her, like brushes past her, my mum described it, ran up the landing, and headed up the stairs stomping his feet. It was late at night, and my mum wasn't amused, as she thought this party of 4 hadn't bothered to tell her they were bringing their child, so she thought she'd have to set up another bed. We used to keep some fold-out beds with mattresses and sheets if we had extra guests, and was quite really annoyed at this party. She goes to greet the party of 4, and after a while of chatting whilst checking in the guests, she told the guests something along the lines of, "Oh, I wish you had told me a little earlier you were bringing your son. I haven't got an extra bed set up in the room yet." As you've probably guessed, the 2 couples looked at each other, quite perplexed, before responding to my mum something along the lines of, "We haven't brought a child with us, it's just us." My mum quite coolly checked the guests in before running to bed. She slept with the lights on that night. When I was 15, I got the opportunity to study in France. Before we got to our homestay families, we had a few days to explore Paris. It was super fun and very beautiful. On our last night, we moved from a newer hotel to an older one in a more historic district. It was visually super beautiful, but had a heavy feeling to it. It was divided into 2 halls. We were at the very end of the left hall, about 20 feet from a closed-off exit. Honestly, the night went pretty normal. At around 8:30, we retired to our rooms. I let my roomies bathe and shower first, so I could email my parents an update. I ended up getting in the shower around 9:25 or 9:30. I got all the way through my shower and had started to dry off when I heard one of them scream my name. I wrapped the towel around myself quickly and ran out of the room. Both roomies sat on the bed against the far wall, huddled together like they were keeping each other safe. Clearly confused, I asked what was wrong. No one looked hurt. One looked at me like I was insane and quickly asked if I hadn't heard it. I hadn't heard anything and asked what she was talking about. The door? It was violently shaking and banging against the deadbolt chain. I turned around and looked at the door, as I honestly thought maybe someone walked by too hard. Maybe the door hadn't been completely closed. Nothing happened. So I went towards my friends and told them my idea as I got dressed. They were passionate that it had absolutely been someone trying to get in. I was definitely the more motherly type out of the girls, and they had called out to me in panic, so I wanted to calm them. I smiled and told them it looked like we would all be in one bed tonight, trying to make light of the situation. When they still didn't move, I said it was probably a group of boys being assholes as per usual. That made them laugh and ease up. Right as I went to climb into bed, the door handle violently started going up and down. The girls jumped under the covers, and I just stood there in shock. It very clearly was someone trying to get in. At this point, I was convinced it was the boys being mean, so I started walking towards the door and I shouted, "Guys, you better stop, it's not fun." And suddenly, the door opened so violently that when the deadbolt chain didn't break, I was surprised. It sounded like someone was kicking and using their whole body to get into our room. I immediately froze. It felt like someone had just poured acid in my throat and ice down my back. Every hair I had stood up on end. There wasn't any shadows. When a person walks in front of the door, there's a shadow, but there wasn't anything there. I quickly moved my body to the wall behind the backside of the door. I looked back and saw my friends watching me and motioned for them to shush. They nodded, and I turned back and watched the door frantically slam against the chain, holding it semi-shut. I took a deep breath, asked God for some strength, and yelled, "Go away right now," as I slammed the door shut as hard as I possibly could and ended up double locking the door. I stepped back and just listened. It sounded like someone was walking away quite roughly. I started taking deep breaths and praying. I started the Lord's Prayer and continued to repeat it in French for good measure after that. Finally, the room felt a little lighter and brighter, but not much. After a few excruciatingly long seconds, I turned around and went and hugged my friends, and again prayed with them while holding hands. After about 10 minutes, I went back to the now quiet door, unlocked the deadbolt, and placed my hand on the handle before yanking the door open as quick as I could. It was a normal, empty hall. I ran to my counselor's room and banged on the door. She wasn't there. Okay, on to the boys' counselor. He wasn't either. I finally started to run towards the other hotel hall when they came running around the corner right into me. They said they had heard me calling for them. They had been in a meeting with the other counselors. I explained what happened and said we girls would feel better if someone checked the room, the locks, the hall, and permanently closed the exit about 20 feet from our room. The hotel gladly obliged and even did security rounds after all night. I know because I didn't sleep a wink. Nothing else happened that night, but the next morning, other rooms started saying how odd things had occurred. None quite so violent, but one girl did suffer sleep paralysis for the first time and said something stood over her. I had never been so happy to leave a hotel before. When I walked outside, I felt like a million years of stress was off my back suddenly. What really creeps me out was that no one that worked at the hotel was shocked. It was August 2018, and we decided to visit the Stanley Hotel on vacation. We checked in, and while the others were grabbing our suitcases, etc., I went up to see our room. Inside the room, while I was waiting, I heard what sounded like a young girl screaming. It sounded close, but not very loud. I looked in the hall and out the window and saw nothing. I woke very early the next morning, 6:45 a.m., and thought I heard a young girl singing. It was quiet, but clear. Everyone was asleep. No one in the hall or outside the windows. I wasn't scared, just curious. There were 3 large windows in our room, old style, no screens, and you have to push them up to open them. Painted over a few times so they were hard to open. One of the windows slammed shut twice while we were in that room. It slammed so hard that a small piece of wood broke off of the frame and landed on the floor. On the second night, we switched rooms with the other family members. Now in room 321, all quiet at bedtime, but very shortly after we settled in, my husband said he couldn't sleep. He's not a believer in spirits. He said the room suddenly felt strange, and he felt like someone was watching us. After he fell asleep, I thought I heard a radio playing. It sounded like an old transistor radio. I looked over at the cell phones to make sure they hadn't started auto-playing something. They were both dark. A minute or two after that, I heard what sounded like a man whispering very close to my ear. I couldn't understand any words. A quick look at hubby and saw he was facing away from me, sound asleep. Shortly after that, just as I was drifting off, I felt 2 distinct pokes on my pillow, as if someone used their finger and tapped the pillow hard. I looked at my husband. He was still facing the other way, snoring. None of these things scared me. I was busy trying to analyze and found them interesting. In the morning, we found the flashlight on my husband's cell phone was on. He said he hadn't touched it, and remember, I looked at the phones after hearing what sounded like a radio, and they were both dark. Putting my bracelet on that morning, I noticed 2 bruises on my arm. I hadn't seen them the night before when I took my bracelet off, and had no idea how they got there. They matched perfectly where the index finger and pinky would sit if my arm had been grabbed with force. I had not, and my daughter, who was an adult, came in as we were all leaving for breakfast, and I noticed a large scratch or rash on the side of her neck. She had no idea it was there, or how it got there, and said it didn't hurt. It had faded and was gone by evening. I posted a review of our visit on TripAdvisor, which includes the pictures of the bruises and rash. I was the front desk manager of a resort in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was high-end, where NFL football teams would stay when they traveled, and all sorts of famous people rolled in and out of there, so I had my fair share of stories. But there's one room we could never rent out, even if we wanted to. Well, one floor I should say. The resort had 2 sides, the east and the west. The east side was the part connected to the lobby. It had a bigger pool, the common room with games, and where breakfast was served. It was far more busier than the west. Each side had 4 floors, and while the 4th floor on the east was fine, same couldn't be said for the west. The 4th floor on the west side was one big room. It had anything you could imagine in there. A grand piano, billiard table, TVs, consoles, full kitchen, a floor of rooms, you name it. That's where we would put the teams or bands who came to stay. It belonged to the owner of the hotel. He made it so he could basically live there as he got older. Well, he passed away a couple of years into me working there, so we decided to rent it out instead. The first couple of occupants would complain about noises and small inconveniences, but around the 6th occupant, things got really out of hand. I remember it so clearly because I was scared out of my mind and didn't know what to do. It was about 2 a.m. and I was working the front desk. I got a call from room 410, 4th floor on the west side, and the caller was panicked and asking to check out immediately. I informed them that I could transfer them to another room or check them out of their stay, and they didn't even consider transferring. They just wanted out. I tried to get an explanation, but all they said was, "I'll tell you more in the lobby," and hung up. I was confused and waited for them to come down. Eventually they did. They were all out of breath and pale. They explained to me that the music just won't stop. They said that the grand piano was playing all night on its own, that the microwave would constantly beep and lights would flicker like strobe lights. I started to get anxious, but I helped them check out. Once that was settled, me and a few late-night co-workers decided we had to check to make sure. What if they were lying and just wanted a free stay for the night? We made our way up there, and it all seemed normal. I was embarrassed that I ever felt scared, and upset that I had refunded such an expensive stay. As we checked all the rooms, we heard a glass shatter. We went back to the kitchen to see an alcohol bottle had broken, and there were shards and drink all over the floor. Next thing we knew, it was all happening again. The lights would flicker, we had heard footsteps, doors would close, and more. We ran out of there as soon as possible. We agreed we wouldn't rent the room out again, and only give tours if asked. The company got bought out, and I got fired along with a bunch of other people. I warned them about room 410 before they fired me, but all they said was, "We get it, maids don't want to clean up that floor of a room, right?" And that was the end of it. No one believes me. Only the people who were in the room know what happened, and everyone else calls BS. But it happened, and I have the scars to prove it. My encounter happened while I was out of town, and while I was on the plane coming back home, I wanted to write down everything that happened while it was fresh in my mind. I have a history of blocking traumatic experiences out and forgetting details, so I really wrote down every little thing, although I don't think I'll be forgetting this one anytime soon. I stayed at the Magnolia Hotel in downtown Dallas this past Sunday through Thursday. I visit Dallas occasionally for work, and I had actually stayed at Magnolia before, about 3 years ago, even though the hotel is old, and one could say it's creepy by nature. Dim lighting, old decor, etc. My last stay was extremely pleasant. I thought it was a cool historic hotel, with big rooms and a great location, which is why I booked it again. This time was not the case. I got in on Sunday evening, and there was a funky smell in the lobby. It was pungent, kind of like those flowers that smell like vomit. I didn't think anything of it. It's an extra touristy part of Dallas, with tons of bars, and could have actually been the smell of vomit, who knows. There was one man at the front desk who got me checked in quickly. I had booked a regular room, and he said he was upgrading me to a suite because I was staying for 4 nights. I was excited about the upgrade, thanked him, and walked to the elevators to go to my room, 2202, on the 22nd floor. The elevators open, and the first notable thing was how hot it was. Dallas is quite warm right now, but the lobby was comfortable, and this felt more like the heat was on, hot stuffy air. I didn't think anything of it. I just thought it was weird for them to keep the heat on when it's been almost 90 degrees over there. The floors are pretty big with 2 halls, one to the left and one to the right immediately after you get out of the elevator. Mine was to the left. I passed maybe 6 other rooms and got to mine. I opened the door, and I don't know how else to describe it other than had a really bad vibe. It was dark and dingy and felt bad in there, like the hallway to my room felt like totally different energies. It was weird because I felt kind of scared and fearful, but wasn't sure why. Like I couldn't control the feeling from my mind or gut or whatever the hell fear comes from. I tried turning more lights on to make it less creepy, but all the fixtures are old, so even with every light on, it's still pretty dim. I didn't want to overthink it, so I unpacked and went out to grab some dinner. I came back to the hotel and just went through the same motions, noticeably bad smell in the lobby, a noticeably warm 22nd floor, and the awful feeling that came over me as I walked into my room. I start getting ready for bed, and that's when the weird stuff started happening. There's lots of shiny surfaces in the room, like 2 TV screens, glass tabletops, and framed art. Every time I looked towards one of these objects, there would be some kind of unexplained movement in it. I wasn't seeing a specific image or anything. It was more like a reflection or shadow walking past behind me, or a weird shift in the lighting or glare. I would hold still and look behind me to try and understand what was happening, but I couldn't make sense of it. The room was a suite, so it was pretty big. It was laid out long, with a small kitchenette where you enter, dining and TV area, bedroom and bathroom. There were 3 or 4 times when I'd be in one area and see something walk by in the room next to me out of the corner of my eye. It was one of the most unsettling feelings I've ever had, but I just kept thinking I had to be imagining things. I'm about to go to bed, and I hear a loud noise come from the closet. It was like the sound made when you open a shower curtain really fast, where the metal hooks roll against the metal rod. I open the closet, and the 5 pieces of clothing I had on hangers are swaying slightly back and forth. I think I'm going crazy at this point. I try to sleep, and obviously very hard after all that, but I really try, convincing myself that I need to get sleep, so I stop imagining things. At around 1:30, my body gets so hot. I'm confused because my room doesn't feel hot, and my bed still feels comfortable, but my body is very warm. I fall asleep for about 30 minutes, and I wake up really startled. I didn't hear or see anything, but it was that feeling you get when someone shakes you when you're sleeping, and you wake up abruptly and confused. Then, a few seconds later, I feel a tug at the end of my bed towards my feet, like someone is pulling slightly on my sheets. I scream and get up to turn the lights on. I'm super scared at this point, looking all around the room trying to find, I don't know, something. I consider calling the front desk, but for some reason, I don't. I just leave the lights on and look at my phone for a while, and get a really awful night's sleep. I'd say I slept about 2 hours on and off. I wake up tired, but feeling alright all things considered. I set the thermostat to 60, and I go to work and go about my day fine, not really even stopping to think about what happened. That night I went to dinner with some co-workers, and they asked me how my hotel is. For whatever reason, I don't want to tell them what happened. I had this feeling come over me like I wasn't supposed to talk about what happened, at least not at the time. I go back to my room that night, and within the first few seconds I'm in there, a shadow walks by again. But this time, it's inches next to me to my left. I am freaked the hell out, and it looked like a tall man. I didn't see a face or person. It was more like an opaque shadow, but I could tell it was a man, the same way you could be walking down the street and tell a man, woman or child was next to you without looking at them. I run towards the door, but stay in the room. I call my boyfriend and tell him what I saw, and he said I had to be imagining things, but if I was really worried, to call the front desk and ask someone to check my room. I hang up and pull up the number to the concierge, but can't bring myself to call it. I had a feeling again come over me, telling me not to talk about what was going on and that I should stay. These events ended up happening every single night. It was almost like I was living with a roommate. There was constant movement. Someone would walk past me in an adjacent doorframe throughout the entire stay. The reflective surfaces would show unexplained activity in them. My body would get boiling hot around 1:30 a.m. and I'd wake up confused, followed by a tug at my feet. I kind of got used to it. Don't get me wrong, I was absolutely terrified the entire time, but I had this feeling like I had to keep quiet and get through it. The last 2 nights also felt a bit different. I was still scared because of all of this wild stuff happening, but I didn't feel like I was in any danger. I was scrolling through my texts, and on the last night, I had texted my boyfriend, "I'm so tired of these shadows watching me. It's getting old," really casually while I was half asleep. I was so excited to check out this morning. I packed up, now avoiding all reflective surfaces, and went downstairs. I grabbed a coffee and had to pee before I left, but obviously did not want to go back to the room, so I went to the bathroom in the business center. I go to wash my hands, and 2 sinks over, the automatic soap dispenses 1 pump and the water runs for about 30 seconds, as recommended by CDC. As I was leaving, I go linger at the front desk for a while, considering telling them what happened. I wait for other guests to clear and go up to the one young girl working there. I ask her if anyone ever reported paranormal or unexplained things happening at the hotel. She said no, but that she was new and not sure. Then she asked me what room I was in, and she said, "Oh, that's weird. They told me never to put people in that hall." Then she asked me who checked me in, and when I told her, she said she didn't know anyone that fits that description. Again, she said she didn't work there very long, and I felt delirious at this point. I was waiting for people to pop out like it was some kind of prank TV show or something. Once I checked out, I felt more comfortable talking about it. I didn't get into details, but I did tell some co-workers that my hotel was haunted, and immediately they were like, "Was it the Adolphus?" which is supposedly very haunted, with a history of murders and freaky stuff, and it's next door to Magnolia. Apparently, Dallas is very haunted, which is news to me, but probably not to many. So that's my story. Like I said, the hotel is old and creepy, but I'm positive that something paranormal was with me there. I've never been into this stuff, but I'm the type to be open to the idea of many things, and I just can't believe it happened to me.